Every dynasty that has ever lost its throne likes to tell you the story the same way. One day there was a kingdom, and the next day there wasn't. A crowd stormed a palace, a general read a proclamation, a family boarded a ship and never came back. That is the version that ends up in textbooks, because it is simple and it is dramatic and it fits on a single page. It is also, for a surprising number of the world's oldest ruling families, not what actually happened. Some dynasties did not fall, they stepped sideways. They handed over a parliament or a prime minister or a constitution and let the cameras record the handover, while the money, the land, the army's loyalty, and the crown's grip on the national imagination stayed exactly where it had always been. The trick was never refusing to give up power. The trick was learning which kinds of power were safe to give away in public and which kinds were worth keeping quiet about. This is the story of 5 royal houses that survived the 20th and 21st centuries not by fighting the tide of democracy, but by getting out in front of it, waving, while keeping one hand firmly on the wheel. Some did it with a signature on a constitution. One did it by stepping off the throne entirely, more than once, and simply putting a relative on it instead. By the end, you will probably never watch a royal abdication ceremony, a promised constitution, or a newly elected parliament the same way again. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Start with the oldest continuous monarchy on Earth, a family so old that its own founding is treated less as history than as scripture. The Chrysanthemum throne traces itself back, in Japan's traditional count, to the year 660 before Christ, and whatever the historical reality behind that date, the imperial line that can be documented with real evidence still stretches back well over 1,000 years without a single interruption. By the summer of 1945, that seemed unlikely to matter much longer. Japan lay in ruins. 2 cities had been destroyed by atomic weapons. Emperor Hirohito, on the 15th of August, spoke to his people by radio for the first time in his life to announce the surrender, in language so formal that many listeners could barely understand the words. In Washington and inside the occupying command in Tokyo, serious people debated whether the emperor should be tried as a war criminal or simply abolished along with the militarist state that had fought in his name. Some historians who have gone back through wartime records argue Hirohito was considerably closer to military decision-making than the post-war narrative ever admitted. General Douglas MacArthur, running the occupation, made a different calculation regardless. He judged that keeping the throne intact, stripped of its old religious authority, would make the occupation of a defeated and humiliated country dramatically easier to manage than dismantling the one institution that still commanded the loyalty of nearly every household in the nation. So a bargain was struck, and Hirohito kept the crown on different terms. On the 1st of January 1946, the emperor issued what is now known as the Humanity Declaration, a carefully worded statement in which he renounced the idea that he was an Akitsumikami, a living god made manifest in human form, a doctrine that had underpinned the entire imperial cult for generations. The new constitution that followed in 1947 went further still. Article 1 made the emperor the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, deriving his position not from divine descent but from the will of the people who hold sovereign power. A later article stripped him explicitly of any function related to government. On paper, the oldest monarchy on the planet had just agreed to become the most powerless one. What the paper did not remove was the enormous cultural weight the throne still carried in a country where nearly every family calendar, every shrine visit, every planting season and harvest festival had been quietly organized around imperial rhythms for centuries. The emperor still performs Shinto rites as Japan's senior priest, rituals almost nobody outside the imperial household agency ever sees, and which the constitution studiously avoids classifying as an exercise of power at all. That quiet cultural authority has repeatedly proven more durable than any elected government's popularity. When Emperor Akihito visited flood and earthquake survivors after the 2011 Tohoku disaster, kneeling on gymnasium floors to speak with people who had lost everything, that visit did more to hold a traumatized country together than any speech a prime minister gave that year, without the emperor ever once appearing to touch politics. In 2019, Akihito did something no Japanese monarch had done in roughly 200 years. He abdicated while still alive, citing his age and declining health, and handed the throne to his son Naruhito in a set of rituals watched by much of the country, closing the Heisei era and opening the one still underway, called Reiwa. Even that transition exposed how carefully bounded the modern throne remains. Imperial law restricts succession strictly to male heirs, which has left the current crown prince, Naruhito's younger brother Akishino, as heir apparent instead of Naruhito's own daughter, Princess Aiko, a fact that periodically reopens a national debate the government has shown little appetite to resolve. The family gave up the crown of a god and kept something a modern government cannot manufacture on demand: unquestioned emotional legitimacy, wrapped in constitutional language that insists none of it means anything. There is a quieter number worth pausing on here. The post-war constitution did not simply strip the emperor of political power, it also stripped nearly the entire extended imperial family of its rank, reducing dozens of collateral branches to ordinary citizens overnight in 1947, and leaving only the emperor's own immediate line inside the palace walls. Imperial law still bars women from ascending the throne and strips any princess of her royal status the moment she marries a commoner, which is precisely what happened to Naruhito and Akishino's own sister, Sayako, in 2005. The practical result, 6 decades later, is a family so small that the government has spent years quietly debating whether the line can even continue on its current rules without eventually running out of eligible men. A dynasty that survived over 1,000 years of war, plague, and foreign occupation now faces the strange possibility of simply running out of princes, because the paperwork that saved it in 1946 never anticipated needing to worry about arithmetic. Move southwest, and you find a very different family that arrived at a remarkably similar arrangement from the opposite direction. The Chakri dynasty of Thailand did not wait for a foreign occupying power to strip its authority. In June 1932, a small group of military officers and civil servants calling themselves the People's Party staged a bloodless coup while King Prajalepok was away at his seaside palace, and forced him to accept Thailand's first constitution, transforming an absolute monarchy into a constitutional one almost overnight. Prajalepok abdicated 3 years later, worn down by conflict with the new civilian government, and died in exile in England in 1941. For a stretch of years afterward, the palace's public standing genuinely receded, overshadowed by the military and civilian politicians who had engineered the revolution. The young king Ananda Mahidol, crowned as a child and largely educated in Switzerland, returned to Thailand only briefly as an adult, before being found shot dead in his palace bedroom in June 1946, in circumstances the country has never fully agreed upon even today. His younger brother, Bhumibol Adulyadej, inherited the throne at 18 almost by accident, and few observers at the time expected the monarchy to matter much longer. It would have been reasonable to assume, watching that sequence, that the Chakri throne was on its way to becoming a ceremonial footnote, the way so many post-imperial monarchies eventually do. Instead, over a reign that stretched to 70 years, Bhumibol rebuilt something that functioned very much like political power, while carefully never being described that way. Military governments from the 1950s onward, particularly under Field Marshal Sarit Thanarat, deliberately revived royal ceremony and royal touring as a tool for their own legitimacy, restoring pageantry the 1932 revolutionaries had deliberately stripped away, and in doing so, handed the palace back its symbolic reach. Bhumibol used that reach directly and publicly at moments of national crisis, most famously in May 1992, when he summoned the leader of a military junta and the leader of the pro-democracy opposition to kneel before him on television and end days of bloodshed in the streets of Bangkok. No parliamentary vote authorized that intervention. None was needed. Decades of coups, and Thailand has had more than a dozen since 1932, have almost always been carried out in the monarchy's name or with its tacit blessing, an arrangement scholars of the country have taken to calling network monarchy, in which the palace, the military, and a web of aristocratic and business families quietly reinforce one another's authority underneath a democratic surface. The financial side of the arrangement has become impossible to ignore in the last decade. For most of the 20th century, the family's vast holdings, land, shares in Thailand's largest banks and conglomerates, were technically managed by the Crown Property Bureau on behalf of the monarchy as an institution rather than the individual on the throne. In 2017 and 2018, under the current king, Maha Vajiralongkorn, the law governing the bureau was rewritten so that those assets, estimated by outside analysts at anywhere between $30 and $60 billion, were transferred into the king's personal ownership, along with the authority to appoint every member of the committee overseeing them, replacing a system that had at least nominally included the finance minister. Journalists cannot easily interrogate any of this, because Thailand's lèse-majesté law makes any statement judged insulting to the monarchy punishable by up to 15 years in prison, a law that is enforced with real regularity rather than sitting quietly on the books. In 2020, young protesters did something almost unthinkable in modern Thai politics and openly called for monarchy reform in the streets of Bangkok, risking prosecution simply for raising the subject aloud. The demonstrations were contained without changing the underlying structure. A country that formally abandoned absolute monarchy in 1932 currently has, by most outside estimates, the wealthiest reigning king on the planet, and a criminal code that makes discussing exactly how he got that way a genuine legal risk for anyone who tries. The 2020 demonstrators were unusually specific about what they wanted, which is part of why the movement frightened the establishment as much as it did. Student leaders read out a list of 10 demands at a rally in August that year, including a reduction of the palace budget, the repeal of the lèse-majesté law, and public accountability for the crown's finances, demands that would have been almost unspeakable in mainstream Thai politics a decade earlier. Hundreds of activists have since been charged under the lèse-majesté statute, some of them teenagers at the time of their alleged offense, and several prominent organizers have received prison sentences running into decades once multiple counts were added together. The protests did not force a single formal concession from the palace. What they did was drag a conversation that had lived for generations only in whispers and academic footnotes out into open daylight, even if saying too much about it out loud in Bangkok still carries a very real cost. Cross the Strait of Gibraltar and the Sahara, and the House of Alawite in Morocco offers a version of the same story with an even more explicit religious dimension built into the constitution itself. The Alawites have ruled Morocco since the middle of the 17th century, claiming direct descent from the Prophet Muhammad, a lineage that gives the throne an authority no elected government in the Arab world can match on paper. Muhammad VI's father, Hassan II, had ruled through what Moroccans still call the Years of Lead, decades from the 1960s into the 1990s, marked by the imprisonment, forced disappearance, and torture of political dissidents, some of them held for years in a secret desert facility at Tasmamart that the government denied existed until survivors began speaking publicly after their release. When Muhammad VI inherited the throne in 1999, he moved quickly to soften that legacy, freeing political prisoners, allowing exiles to return, and in 2004, establishing an Equity and Reconciliation Commission to investigate and publicly document the abuses of his father's rule. The commission was widely praised internationally as a rare example of an Arab monarchy confronting its own past. It was also carefully designed never to name or prosecute any specific official responsible for what had happened, which meant reconciliation arrived without anyone inside the system actually being held to account. In February 2011, as uprisings spread from Tunisia to Egypt to Syria, protest movements calling themselves the February 20 movement filled the streets of Rabat and Casablanca, demanding real constitutional limits on royal power. King Mohammed VI responded quickly, before the protests could gather the momentum they achieved elsewhere, announcing sweeping constitutional reforms that went to a national referendum that July. The new constitution strengthened the elected parliament, required the king to appoint a prime minister from the party that won the most seats rather than one of his own choosing, and gave that head of government, now formally titled head of government rather than merely prime minister, expanded authority to appoint civil servants. International commentary at the time was largely favorable, describing Morocco as a rare Arab Spring success story, a monarchy that had chosen reform over repression. Read the fine print of that same constitution, and the picture looks considerably less like a transfer of power. The king remains, in the document's own language, inviolable, a legal status no other Moroccan citizen holds. He retains sole authority to appoint the country's most senior judges through a council he personally chairs, meaning judicial independence in Morocco flows, formally and explicitly, from royal patronage. He commands the armed forces outright, presides over the country's Security Council, and holds broad emergency powers that require no parliamentary approval to invoke. And beneath the political constitution sits a second, older one, the king's status as Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, a title that gives him direct religious authority over Islamic practice in Morocco, a role no elected body can touch, and no referendum was ever going to put up for a vote. Analysts who study the Moroccan system describe the everyday machinery of real decision-making, the palace's inner circle of advisors and appointees known locally as the Makhzen, as having changed remarkably little beneath the new constitutional language. The king gave up the title of absolute monarch. He kept the army, the judiciary, and God. There is one more area where the elected government's authority quietly stops at the palace gate, and it involves the territory Morocco calls its southern provinces and most of the rest of the world calls Western Sahara, a former Spanish colony whose sovereignty has been disputed since Spain withdrew in 1975. Every government that has held office in Rabat since then, regardless of party, has been required to treat the territory's annexation as a non-negotiable article of national policy, a position set by the palace rather than by any parliamentary vote, and never seriously questioned by any mainstream Moroccan politician who wants a career. Foreign policy on the issue that has shaped Morocco's international relationships more than any other single question for half a century is decided in the palace, not in parliament, regardless of what the 2011 constitution says about a strengthened head of government setting national priorities. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Cambodia offers something rarer still, a monarch who worked out that abdication itself could be wielded as a political weapon rather than an ending. Norodom Sihanouk became king in 1941 at the age of 18, installed by French colonial administrators who assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that a teenager with no political experience would be easy to control. He led Cambodia to full independence from France in 1953, and then, in March of 1955, did something almost no reigning monarch in the modern era has chosen to do voluntarily. He abdicated the throne entirely, handing the crown to his own father, Norodom Suramarit, not because he had lost a power struggle, but specifically so that he could re-enter public life as an ordinary citizen and run for office. As a mere prince rather than a sitting king, Sihanouk was free to found a political movement, the Sankum Reister Neum, campaign in elections, and take the position of prime minister, a role the constitution had placed off limits to the monarch himself. The Sankum won every seat in that year's parliamentary election. Sihanouk had effectively traded a hereditary throne with limited constitutional authority for an elected office with dramatically more of it, and he had done so by making the throne disappear and reappear in his father's name instead. When Suramarit died in 1960, Sihanouk did not reclaim the crown. He became head of state under a different title, keeping the flexibility that had served him so well, steering Cambodia through the 1960s with a foreign policy built around fragile neutrality between Washington, Beijing, and Hanoi. It took a decade of Cold War maneuvering, a 1970 coup led by General Lon Nol that removed him while he was traveling abroad, years of exile in Beijing running a government in name only, and the unimaginable catastrophe of the Khmer Rouge years, during which Sihanouk was held for a period under a kind of house arrest inside his own former palace, while roughly a quarter of the country's population died, before the monarchy itself returned to Cambodian life at all. He had, controversially, lent his name and his prestige to the Khmer Rouge coalition for a period after their fall in order to keep international pressure on the Vietnamese-backed government that replaced them, a decision that still complicates how historians assess him. Under a peace process brokered by the United Nations, Sihanouk was restored to the throne in September 1993, 69 years old and improbably still the most recognizable political figure in the country he had first ruled as a French-appointed teenager. He held the crown for another 11 years before ill health forced a second and final abdication in 2004, this time in favor of his son, Norodom Sihamoni, a former ballet dancer and dance instructor who had spent much of his adult life in Prague and Paris with almost no political ambition of his own. Sihamoni remains king today, unmarried and with no designated heir, a strictly ceremonial figure whose most consequential act is arguably the fact that he does not act at all, while real executive power sits with Cambodia's long-serving prime minister and his successors. The Norodom dynasty survived a genocide that killed close to 2 million people, a fact worth sitting with for a moment before moving on, and the tool that carried the family through it was never armed resistance. It was the willingness of one man to take his own crown off, put it back on, and take it off again, exactly when doing so served him best. The mechanics of how a new Cambodian king is even chosen still carry the fingerprints of that flexibility. Unlike most surviving monarchies, the Cambodian crown is not strictly hereditary by birth order. A 9-member throne council, made up of the prime minister, senior monks, and legislative leaders, selects the next king from among eligible male descendants of 2 rival royal branches, the Norodom and Sisowath lines, a system originally designed by French colonial administrators to keep the Cambodian throne permanently dependent on outside approval rather than able to assert automatic dynastic authority. Sihanouk himself was chosen this way in 1941 over other, arguably more senior candidates precisely because French officials judged him easiest to manage. Sihamoni's own selection in 2004 followed the same council process. A dynasty that has spent 8 decades treating the crown as something that can be handed off, refused, reclaimed, and handed off again, turns out to have never actually controlled who wears it in the first place, which may be exactly why it has proven so difficult to eliminate. There is no single figure whose death or exile can end the institution, only a council that keeps finding someone new. The final family in this story shows what happens when the pretense finally runs out. The Al-Sabah dynasty has ruled the territory that became Kuwait since 1752, and for most of the 20th century it managed something genuinely unusual among the Gulf's oil monarchies: a real, elected National Assembly, established under the 1962 Constitution, with actual opposition politicians who could summon government ministers for public questioning and occasionally force them to resign. That arrangement was tested severely in August 1990, when Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein invaded and occupied the entire country within hours, sending the ruling family fleeing to Saudi Arabia, while ordinary Kuwaitis endured 7 months of occupation before a United States-led coalition drove the Iraqi army out. When the family returned to a liberated Kuwait in 1991, many citizens who had organized resistance during the occupation expected genuine political reward for what they had endured, and the restored monarchy did, for a time, allow parliamentary life to expand rather than contract. Compared with the tightly closed political systems of its neighbors, Kuwait spent decades afterward being described by outside observers as the most democratic country in the Gulf, and the ruling family clearly understood the reputational value of that description. What rarely made it into the same headlines was how often the arrangement got switched off whenever it produced results the palace disliked. The emir has the constitutional authority to dissolve the National Assembly, and he has used it again and again, 13 separate times between 2006 and 2024 alone, frequently after nothing more dramatic than a parliamentary committee asking uncomfortable questions about a minister who happened to be a member of the ruling family. Key ministries, defense, interior, and foreign affairs among them, have been reserved for Al-Sabah appointees as a matter of routine practice rather than law, regardless of which party held the most seats in the chamber next door. No elected parliament in Kuwait's history has ever served a complete 4-year term without interruption. Money explains a good deal of why the family could afford to let the assembly exist at all. Kuwait sits on some of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, and decades of exporting it have built the Kuwait Investment Authority, a sovereign wealth fund whose holdings are estimated at somewhere near $1 trillion, one of the largest pools of state-controlled capital anywhere in the world. A government sitting on that kind of cushion can afford to let an elected chamber grill a minister on television, hand out generous public salaries and subsidized housing to its citizens, and still never risk its actual grip on the country's wealth, because the Assembly's authority was always structured to stop well short of the family's core financial holdings, no matter how loud the questioning got. Compared with Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, where no national elected legislature with real power has ever existed at all, Kuwait's arrangement looked for decades like genuine restraint. It was restraint with a very specific, very narrow ceiling built into it from the very beginning. In May 2024, the pretense collapsed in public. Sheikh Mishal al-Ahmad al-Jaber al-Sabah, who had become emir only months earlier following the death of his half-brother, dissolved the newly elected assembly and suspended entire articles of the Constitution, announcing in a televised address that the legislature had been exploited to obstruct the country's interests, and that the palace would now govern directly for a period of up to 4 years, while the political system was, in his words, re-evaluated. He pointed in particular at unnamed officials he accused of interfering with his right to select a crown prince, a decision the Constitution reserves for the emir alone, and as of this recording, no permanent successor to that position had been formally settled. It was only the 3rd time in the country's history that the elected chamber had been suspended outright rather than merely dissolved and re-elected, And unlike the two previous suspensions in the 1970s and 1980s, this one came with no clear promise of exactly when, or whether, an assembly with real teeth would return. For 60 years, the Al-Sabahs had let Kuwaitis vote, argue, and occasionally win, so long as the family's core authority over money, the military, and the throne itself was never seriously threatened underneath the noise. When a newly elected chamber finally pushed hard enough on the question of who gets to choose the next crown prince, the family that had spent 6 decades performing constitutional restraint simply stopped performing it, and remarkably little in Kuwaiti daily life outwardly changed as a result. What connects a Shinto emperor in Tokyo, a Chakri king whose wealth outstrips Gulf oil fortunes, an Alawite sultan governing through a mosque as much as a ministry, a Cambodian dynasty that treated its own crown as a costume to be put on and taken off, and a Kuwaiti family that finally dropped the act after 60 years, is not any shared conspiracy or coordinated plan. None of these families studied the other's playbooks. What they share is a far simpler and older piece of political instinct, the recognition that a crown taken by force invites a violent answer, while a crown that is seen to be given away, gradually, publicly, and on terms the family itself controls, tends to be left alone. Parliaments can be created without ever being allowed real teeth. Constitutions can expand on paper while quietly protecting the one clause that matters most. Abdication can function less as surrender and more as a costume change, timed for maximum political advantage. And when even the appearance of restraint becomes more trouble than it is worth, the mask can simply come off, so long as it happens gradually enough that nobody quite agrees on the exact moment it happened. Republics tend to fall all at once, in a single dramatic afternoon that becomes a chapter title in a history book. The dynasties that have lasted longest into the modern world did the opposite. They fell in slow motion, so slowly that, in 5 very different countries on 4 different continents, it is still not entirely clear that they have finished falling at all. Every one of these families is still there right now, today, holding titles, land, and in at least 2 cases, enormous personal fortunes, while the countries around them describe themselves, entirely accurately according to their own constitutions, as democracies. None of the 5 had to defeat an army or outlast a revolution to manage it. They only had to understand, earlier and more clearly than the people cheering in the streets around them, that the ceremony of giving something up in public is very often cheaper and very often safer than actually giving it up at all. The throne did not need to survive the 20th century by outlasting the idea of democracy. It only needed to survive by learning to wear it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.